Well, one more question before I open it up. The stimulus funding. Seems every day we read a story in the paper, usually after the fact, about a dubious amount of money being targeted at a dubious project. Where do you and your colleagues stand in your abilities to get at the heart of how that money is being managed? Are you getting cooperation from the administration? Or is it just so much money that it's unmanageable?
Well, first of all, there's two pots of a roughly $800 billion that are walking around money. One is the stimulus, one is the TARP. They both have the same thing in common, which is we will be forensic in finding out where the money was spent, but both of them have very little in the way of control over, if you will, redirecting those funds. So I come to you a little bit like Gandhi, saying, I can tell you what's wrong and what the injustices are, but don't expect that the minority is going to be able to change it. Even the majority would have to use very harsh tools in voting in order to really stop this. And I'll give you one example. Currently, the estimate is, and this is Republican and Democrats and administration people, that we've gotten all the jobs we're going to get from the stimulus. Well, if you look at that based on the money allocated versus the amount of jobs saved, it's about $533,000 per job saved. If you were to divide it all up and assume that it's going to go as well as they say it will go, it's going to be about $70,000 for every job saved. Now, that's a best case. Whether it's $500,000 a job or $70,000 a job, I defy anybody to believe for a moment that if you gave an employer $70,000 on the condition that he hired 2 employees for a year, that you couldn't find that subsidy hiring 2 employees, maybe 3, maybe 4. Our problem is that the administration's own numbers on the stimulus, if to be believed, are very bad performance relative to the American taxpayer dollar. Keeping somebody working for $70,000 a year at a cost of $70,000 a year, taking a best case analysis, is too much, because it means that net we have no real job. We've simply taken your money to pay somebody else to do something. That's one of our challenges. And then secondly, on the TARP, today the second half, almost the entire second half of the TARP, $318 billion, is unspent and available. That money, 100%, under any reasonable adversary relationship between between the Congress and the President, meaning if the Democrats were doing their job, we would have a rescission. How many of you believe that today the original intent of the TARP to stabilize markets that were collapsing is still in place? Any reasonable, and I hold my Congress in disrespect over it, we should call back 100% of those dollars today. Now, it doesn't mean that if the President comes in and says, we have a program to do X, and we believe it will achieve Y, and therefore we need you to give us Z worth of money, that we shouldn't go through the XYZs. But ask all of you, why in the world, in the name of transparency, would you leave $318 billion worth of walking around money, none of which is going to be spent for the original intent over the next 2 years? That's probably the biggest failure of Congress, is not calling for and bringing back the second half of the TARP, which is essentially unspent but still being applied to various uses along with money that comes back.
What I'll do is I'll open up the questions to members of our audience. We will have a microphone, so don't speak unless you have a microphone in front of you. And if you could identify yourself, and if you're a member of the media, identify your media organization or affiliation as well. I appreciate it. Any questions? Right here. Jenny.
Hi, Congressman. Chris Brown, New Majority. You mentioned the census earlier. Do you support the Vitter Amendment to the Commerce, Justice, and Science Appropriations Bill that would deny funding to the Census Bureau in 2010 if it doesn't include questions relating to an individual's immigration status or citizenship?
Well, you had me until, one, you used a senator, and I would look for a House bill. 2, denying funding is unthinkable. The census is a constitutional obligation every 10 years, and our committee oversees that. So should we provide funds to either get some anecdotal information or 100%? Yeah, we should. And we should for a reason, which is that what we don't know can hurt us. Are we allocating funds according to where people are? Yes. Are we counting every person legal and not legal status? Yes, because the Constitution doesn't differentiate. But are we allocating voting districts? And I happen to be from a net recipient state in case of California. Are we allocating how many congressmen you get based on people legally here, or are we aggregating the two and thus giving perhaps California one or two more congressmen and women than they deserve and giving Ohio maybe one less than they deserve? So there really is a valid reason to get that information. I would join with the senator to get that information, but let's make sure we get it for the right reason, which is we have an obligation to count persons here, whether they're legal or illegal, but we don't have an obligation to use that information poorly or to not know what we should know.
Yes, Senator, right here, please.
I've got a winning row now. You know, let's go right down it.
This is always to puzzle me. As I understand it, if I were a private company and I set up a retirement system comparable to the Social Security, I'd be probably bought up for fraud. Now, how is it that government can continue to run a Social Security program or all these things with this tremendous unfunded obligations and get away with it? I mean, why is there? What does the public? Is no one educating the public about this, or what? What we got to do?
Well, this is a great question about whether or not, and I've used the term Ponzi scheme on Social Security very publicly too, because it fits there even better. But since you brought up public versus private, I will tell you the private model is pretty easy to understand. If you decide to give your retirees dollars every year out of general revenues, and let's say you're General Motors, and you pay them over and above any contractual obligation or vesting, you continue to pay them other expenses, or in the case of General Motors, they were paying people they'd laid off years ago to go do charity work. Everyone understands that the only way you can pay that is if you have current revenues. And everyone understands those current revenues, in the case of General Motors, were hurting the company's ability to reinvest in competitive natures. It was causing the GM car to be artificially high compared to their competitors. We have the same problem. By the fact that Social Security is not vested with real money, that it's a promise, a pretty large promise, to keep escalating in perpetuity with, unfortunately, less and less current employees for more and more retirees, that it's unsustainable, that will hurt our competitiveness, that it represents a great threat to America's ability to take care of both our seniors and our previous generation. So how does the government do it? Because we're allowed to do just that. We're allowed to pretend that the next taxpayer and the next taxpayer will be as benevolent as the promise, when in fact the taxpayers can renege on our seniors at a moment's notice. And it's one of the reasons that we have to secure a change in Social Security, is so that we can keep the promise to those already retired by changing the promise to those who will retire in the future. If we don't do that, our seniors should not rest assured that they're going to continue to get what they're getting, because at some point somebody has to come up short, and I don't want it to be the person who can no longer go back to work.